participating, be it through Zoom or social media, be it Facebook or YouTube. I am Erika Calderon, and I work for the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation of Agriculture, IECA. And we are in charge of the coordination of all these webinars. It's been almost 3 years since we started broadcasting monthly for all of you when it comes to the preparation for the prevention and response of cross-border diseases, including African swine fever. This is an interagency initiative that works under the GFTATS. There are many agencies involved in this coordination effort, and we have CARIBET, CAPSTA, WOA, LACAM, CBP, USDA, OIRSA, COPEC, and IECA, of course. So this is a joint effort that we have prepared for you alongside all these trainings in different topics that are required to be prepared to prevent and respond to cross-border diseases, particularly ASF. All this information is on the platform that will be shared later on in the chat, a platform where you'll be able to find all presentations we've had throughout the years and all the support materials. We are going to have a very interesting webinar when it comes to zoning, compartmentalization, and regionalization. And we have for these presentations that we'll have today some general aspects and the foundation for zoning, compartmentalization, and regionalization. We're going to have Dr. Cristobal Cepeda, who works for the USDA APHIS. We're going to have also the U.S. experiences shared by Dr. Tracy Sturgill from the USDA APHIS as well. And we're also going to have an experience from Mexico presented by Dr. Figueroa. We would like to start with our first presentation from Dr. Cristobal Cepeda. He is the Regional Director for North America for the USDA APHIS on International Services, and also the Chair of the Scientific Commission of Animal Diseases for WOA. I would only like to remind you that this webinar is being broadcasted in 4 languages: Spanish, English, French, and Portuguese. So you can select the language of your choice. And at the same time, I would like to invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat by sharing with us the country that you represent and the company that you work for so that we can have it on record. Dr. Cepeda, the floor is yours. We can start. Thank you.
¿Pueden ver mi presentación en
Excelente.
pantalla completa?
Sí.
Yes.
Ya aprendí. Gracias. Buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everyone. I am Cristobal Cepeda. Even though I work for APHIS, USDA, today I am talking to you under my role of Chair of the Scientific Commission of WOA. And the topic I would like to address are the requirements for terrestrial animals in relation to zoning and compartmentalization. We are going to start by defining what these concepts are. Based on WOA, zoning is a procedure to define subpopulations of animals with a different health situation based on geographic criteria. Compartmentalization has the same goal, But this separation of the populations with the different statuses is based on biosafety and management. So we can see that for zoning, we can have a country with areas that are free and others that are infected. We can also have some compartments and others that are infected. And what defines these compartments is a biosafety border, which is equal to the one established between a free zone or one with free status, and this applies to each of the components of each compartment. What are we currently doing or proposing for many years now? It is a change in our approach, because all control and eradication programs, we can think about tuberculosis, brucellosis, and many others, start from the basis of establishing herds or farms that are disease-free. The accumulation of these free herds leads to a free zone, and the accumulation of these areas within a country leads to a free status country. So what we are currently proposing is that previously we were only able to have international trade based on countries with free status, but after this zoning, we are now under the possibility of having international trade or foreign trade. And with this compartmentalization, we are expanding this possibility in order to have a foreign trade based on these sub-compartments. Both the concepts are similar because the goal is to recognize those populations that are free and to separate them from those that have been infected. And the difference is who will be responsible for the application of these biosafety measures. When it comes to zoning, this is the official zone, like the veterinarian services in the country, who are responsible for maintaining this separation between a free zone and an infected zone. As for compartmentalization, the responsibility and it falls on the private sector. And in order to establish this confinement, we need a very rigorous surveillance on behalf of the official veterinary services. The WOA code recognizes and defines the 4 types: the free zones, the infected zones, and 2 concepts that are relatively new, which are the protection area and the contention area. So a free zone is an area in which the absence of diseases under this consideration has been demonstrated. The use of the word demonstration in this definition is very important because it implies that we need to have epidemiological surveillance and a series of actions in order to be able to base this declaration of a free zone. And an infected zone is an area in which there's been a diagnosis of an outbreak as defined on the relevant chapters of the terrestrial code of WOA. The diseases for which an official recognition is given are the ones in this blue, like foot and mouth disease, pneumonia, bovine, and infectious, classic swine fever, small ruminants, and equine African fever. And as for all these diseases, if a country does not meet all the conditions for a free zone, it's not going to be officially recognized by WOA, and it will be then considered as an infected country, and thus countries that have a trade with these countries need to apply these criteria for trade with an infected zone. As I said, other types of zones have been recently established, like the protection zone and also the contention zone. The protection zone is optional. It is not mandatory to have it and should not be mandatorily followed by a country, but this is a zone in which sanitary and biosafety measures are implemented to prevent the entry of a pathogenous agent from a country that has been infected into an infection-free zone. So this can be established either within the country or the free zone or out of it, outside. So on our prior version, before the adoption of these protection and contention zones criteria, when there was a protection zone that had been established within a free zone or country, and then we had an outbreak within that protection zone, then the rest of the country lost this status. If we establish this protection zone outside of the free zone or free country, and then we have outbreaks on this protection zone, then this status was kept for these areas or countries. Nowadays, what we are currently doing is the modification of what really goes on in the case of outbreaks. So if we have an increase in risk, a free country or zone can establish these protection zones, and in the event of outbreaks within this protection area, the status for all the rest of the country is maintained, and thus they can keep on establishing international or foreign trade. Now, we can also consider vaccines within a protection zone. And in the case of outbreaks, the status will be the same for the rest of the country or zone. What does change is the status for that protection zone, because now it's going to be a vaccine zone. So in the prior version, to summarize, when there were outbreaks in those protection areas, the status was lost. But in the current version, for the chapter on protection zones, then the status is kept for the country in the event of outbreaks within these protection areas. We have some examples worldwide. One of them is the Choco zone, which is free of foot and mouth disease without vaccine, that was set in order to protect Panama and the rest of Central America from the possible entry of foot and mouth disease. In Europe, the European Union has established in Turkey a free zone without vaccine for free and mouth disease in order to protect the rest of the European Union. And these are examples of protection areas that have been established out of the borders that we want to protect. In the US, in the presence of African swine fever in La Española, in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, it was self-defined, including Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and the US as a protection area, which means that in the event of an outbreak or the entry of African swine fever into Puerto Rico, the rest of the United States, the continental US, will remain as a free zone when it comes to foot and mouth disease. And the other concept is that the contention zone, and it has been defined in relation to infected exploitations in the event of an outbreak. This contention zone can be established around all the outbreaks, and once the disease has been controlled, you can resume foreign trade in all the territory outside of this contention zone. And the purpose of these contention zones is to gain some time before resuming international trade. So when we have an outbreak in a country, that country will be considered as infected and foreign trade will be suspended. But the country can implement these contention measures, and when the disease is under control and it's not being spread anymore, then we can reestablish for the remaining of the territory where this disease has already been controlled. And this is what we really do all the time when we have outbreaks. In the case of the United States, for example, we have an infected zone, we have a buffer zone, and a control and surveillance area. Once this is under control, it can be recognized as a contention area. So the contention area, in summary, if we have outbreaks in a free zone or country, then we can establish some control measures. Once the disease is under control, but the times in order to resume the criteria for all the freedom, yet then the rest of the country or free zone can be still recognized as a free zone once we have limited this contention area. But there is also a second option that establishes that even if a disease or outbreak is not absolutely eradicated or under control or disinfected, we can establish an inside and an external contention areas, and this can all be implemented as contention zones in the event of an outbreak within the zone recognized as an external area. Then the whole country will lose the status, but they can keep on participating with foreign trade. As examples for the application of regionalization or zoning, we have many of them. In South America, when it comes to foot and mouth disease, there are some areas that have been recognized as free without vaccination, or we have examples in Bolivia, Paraguay, and many other countries. And this is the case of Colombia, which is an foot and mouth disease-free zone in Colombia, and the one we have in brown, and there's another protection area, which is the one that we have in green. And also in Brazil, we have different areas that have been recognized as free zones with and without vaccination, and the same for Bolivia and Argentina. Other countries have also made an effort to apply regionalization for foot and mouth disease in Kazakhstan, where they have free zones with and without vaccination, and they have several free zones with and without vaccination. And the goal for all of these is that if we had an introduction of foot and mouth disease in the areas, only that particular area would lose its status, but not all other areas. They will be able to maintain their status with or without vaccination. And switching gears now, we'll move on to compartments. And these are not recognized officially by WOA. And this happens bilaterally among the countries. And there are different criteria that apply for the definition of these compartments. One is to define the units that are part of this compartment, how we can separate epidemiologically this compartment from others, from other animals that may have been infected. And very important is that we need to document all the critical factors in the definition for this compartment.
To look at critical aspects
we need epidemiological surveillance both in and out of this compartment. We need diagnosis capacity in the country to detect diseases that we will establish this compartment for. We need to have emergency measures, supervision and control.
And surveillance. Compartments are defined as follows during times of peace, where there's no disease presence. And we can also define the compartment strategy before an outbreak. So if an outbreak occurs, these compartments that are already acknowledged can continue to trade and market produce. Now, or market the products. So the idea is that we need to establish disease-free compartments while trade takes place. So let's see the following diagram in blue. We have integrated poultry farms that are in the private market. And we also have backyard poultry production. So in blue, we see the the disease-free compartments in the blue. And if there is infection, that area would be isolated and the rest of the compartments would continue to trade. So previously acknowledged compartments could also continue to trade internationally. So in an endemic area where the disease can be present in backyard poultry, but not in backyard chickens, but not in our commercial animals. So these compartments in blue can continue to trade. These compartments can also be established with zonification, or zoning rather. And this is when an area of a country made more headway before the other in eradicating a disease. And the production unit remained within an infected area. And here we had a single day chicks, and now the entire system had been compromised. Compartmentalization can acknowledge this as part of the free zone and thereby not prevent mobilization of products or animals or whatever is being produced in that unit. I am nearing the end of my presentation, and if we could have the Q&A session right after this presentation, that'd be wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Cepeda. We don't have many questions from the chat. Please ask your questions in the chat. Dr. Campuzano and myself have questions. For the Dominican Republic, that is dealing with ASF and an outbreak thereof, how do you believe that this can be addressed, trying to release or to free the country from this disease? Should we compartmentalize, or what do you suggest? I coordinated along with APHIS in the Dominican Republic. One of the options that were considered at that point in time, but did not progress, is to acknowledge disease-free zones in the eastern side of the Dominican Republic, which is a more touristy area and where there are few pig farms or swine farms. So the idea is to carry out zoning there, acknowledge that area is disease-free, and then move on to other areas. We could also consider disease-free compartments that could continue to emulate these other disease-free zones. Now, we've been working with the Dominican Republic, and we've been trying to adhere to a strategy as to how to progress there. I think that would be the best way to address this. So we do have questions. Dr. Camposano, do you have a question by any chance? I do. Doctor, would you mind explaining how to carry out these measures in trade? If there's a country that's impacted and carries out trade readily, how can a country still carry out trade despite this? What type of support can be provided? Well, let me focus on the protection area and the contention area as a way to facilitate continuity of trade. This protection area, okay, let me give you the US and Puerto Rico example. If we had not acknowledged Puerto Rico as a protected area, then ASF in Puerto Rico, then many countries could consider that all of the United States, continental United States, would be considered as being impacted. Establishing the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico as a protection zone means that if there were an outbreak in these protection zones, the rest of the United States, the continental United States, would continue to be disease-free. And that's a great that's a great tool to depend on because it can continue to carry out exports. All right, thank you. We have various questions, Dr. Cepeda. They're in the chat. We're being asked, would you mind explaining how zoning, compartmentalizing, and regionalization, is that your question, Rocio? Okay, okay, so let me move on to the next question. Pardon. In the hypothetical case in disease-free zones, let's say there's a AFS disease that is found after quarantine, then another case is found in a contention area. Can what would the area lose its sanitary status? Okay, if a source of infection is detected, let's say AFS, before the country declares that area of contention or contention zone, it has to have declared, it has to have controlled the disease, or if it's in the process of containing it, then this area of contention can be established, and the country can again embark on international trade. If there's an outbreak that occurs outside of that area of contention, then the entire country loses its status for trade. Juan Manuel Castro says, in an area of contention zone, how do we measure the time or the area? How do we measure that area, that zone? Okay, good question. Good point. We're discussing this right now at WOA, the possibility of having more than one contention zone in a country. An example that came up, and this is something that I heard from Colombia, which has never experienced AFS. And this is an example from Colombia. In Colombia, AFS was introduced from a neighboring country. And there were cases in 3 areas. Since the buffer zone, there's only one buffer zone could be established, the degree of the territory that had to be covered was huge. And it's more practical to be able to have established three areas, three containment area or buffer zones. And that's what we're discussing right now at WOA. But currently, only one buffer zone is allowed. We have another question. Wow, many questions right now.
¿Cómo influye? Nos pregunta Brand Siegel, que es
Brand Siegel says,
¿cómo influye la
how
presencia de peste porcina
does the
africana
presence of AFS impact wild or wild with regard to the wild pigs?
Depende mucho de la distribución de estos animales, cerdos asilvestrados o jabalíes. Por ejemplo, en algunos países de la Unión Europea se tiene bastante bien definido dónde están y dónde no están estas poblaciones animales y han podido zonificar. Por ejemplo, Bélgica me parece que tuvo un enfoque de zonificación en una zona donde hubo un brote de peste porcina africana en cerdos silvestres. De la misma manera, se puede previamente establecer compartimentos, por ejemplo, en las granjas de producción comercial, y si existiera la enfermedad en cerdos silvestres, el compartimento se mantiene libre y puede seguir comercializando internacionalmente.
Perfecto. Vamos a hacer unas 3 preguntas más y nos detenemos para poder continuar con el webinar, para no salirnos mucho del horario. Entonces, por acá nos pregunta...
También aclarar que cualquier cosa se le pueden mandar al doctor para que,
Sí, de hecho.
para que no se estrese él ni los que lo preguntan.
Sí. Por acá nos preguntan cuánto tiempo le toma a un país definir la zona segura cuando existe un brote. Mientras se define esa zona, el país perdería su estatus y no podría exportar hasta que sea reconocida las otras zonas por el país importador.
No me queda claro si la pregunta es respecto al establecimiento de zonas libres o de zonas de contención.
Se refiere a zona segura, me imagino que zona libre.
Bueno, una zona libre requiere
de contención, por ahí.
A free zone or a contention zone. And this contention zone, well, this would be the possible scenario. If we have a free zone, and then we have African swine fever, then the country loses the status and is considered as infected, and thus they cannot export. If these outbreaks are limited, then the country can start controlling them and establish a contention zone. But the time needed for the establishment of these contention zones will depend on the country and the speed at which the measures are being implemented, be it something related to vaccination or sanitary measures, control and surveillance. So, for diseases that have been officially recognized by WOA, then the Scientific Commission has the authority. Once the country sends the information in relation to that contention zone, of recognizing it immediately without having to go through the general section and the approval of the representatives. So I think that this can expedite that mechanism and allows to resume trade faster. Sir, I'll ask a last question in the interest of time, because we have so many questions, but we'll send them to you to see if we can answer to all of them. And the next question from Claudio Angulo says, if we have a compartment on an infected zone related to a productive system on a free zone, like the last example presented, should both zones have compartments so that for each productive system? In my example, it would be a single compartment, but recognizing that unit that was left into an infected zone as part of that compartment. But I repeat, this needs to be bilaterally recognized so that this compartment can be allowed to export. I would really like to thank you for your presentation, Dr. Cepeda. It's been really interesting and it has generated a lot of interest. So we'll have to address this even further. Thank you very much. And thank you for being with us. I would really like to thank you for the invitation. And it's a pleasure to have so many questions. Thank you. I think that there's much interest that has been generated, and that's why we wanted to give it the relevance for these webinars in this platform. So thank you again. Thank you very much and see you soon.
Bueno, continuando con el webinar del día de hoy, ahora vamos a tener la experiencia de parte de Estados Unidos con la doctora Tracy
We're going to hear from Dr. Tracy Sturgill. She is director of the from the Department of Agriculture of the United States for USDA APHIS in evaluation of regionalization of vet services. She also works at the USDA. She's been there since 2013, where she's held different positions at various diagnostic labs for the veterinary sector and international trade. Dr. Tracy is also a great learner, so she worked with large species as a vet before returning to graduate school that was focused on immunology, on neonatal equine immunology and infectious disease. She will speak about the United States and regionalization, zoning, and compartmentalization, especially with regard to ASF. So you have the floor, Dr. Sturgill.
My screen sharing.
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah. All right. First, I would like to apologize for my slides only being in English. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak today about the strategies that the United States have employed for African swine fever preparedness from the trade perspective and for the continuity of trade in the event of an outbreak. So the United States takes a multimodal approach for facilitating safe trade and preparing for continuity of trade in the event of an African swine fever outbreak in commercial swine in the United States. And we do this by completing import risk analyses to evaluate the animal health status of trading partners. We also evaluate the feasibility and, when possible, develop bilateral zoning protocols with trading partners to mutually recognize each other's established zones. Additionally, APHIS established the African Swine Fever Protection Zone in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, as Dr. Cepeda had intimated, and I will talk more on that later today. And then finally, I will briefly discuss compartmentalization as another World Organization for Animal Health, or WOA, tool, even though the United States is not currently applying it to African swine fever preparedness. So APHIS restricts the importation of some animals and animal products due to the animal health status of the exporting or transit region. Thus, we use the concept of regionalization to evaluate import risk and animal health statuses of foreign regions. Now, before I get into this and into the details of this, I just want to say that the terminology, I want to address some of the terminology because some of the terminology is different across different countries, across different organizations. And the terms regions and regionalization are often used interchangeably with zones and zoning. But for APHIS, these terms are not synonymous. And of course, to further confuse this issue, the WOA definition and use of zones and zoning is not the same as the APHIS definition and use, and WOA does not define or use the term region or regionalization. And APHIS regionalization process is based on a key principle from the World Trade Organization's sanitary and phytosanitary measures that recognizes that certain regions can be free of a disease, even if other parts of the country are affected. And in accordance with that, with the SPS agreement and the WOA, our national animal health laws require that for certain animal commodities, particularly live animals and fresh meat products, the country or region of origin needs to be disease-free or unaffected by certain diseases or pests in order to export products to the United States. And this is one of the ways that we safeguard against incursions of significant livestock diseases such as African swine fever or ASF. Now, obviously, Dr. Zepeda has previously discussed a number of the WOA processes, and I'm going to try to not repeat what he has said, instead just focusing primarily on what we as APHIS do. So when we evaluate the animal health statuses of other countries, we use a step-by-step procedure, and we use WOA's framework for risk analysis to we use that to establish our process. And the official list of APHIS recognized animal health disease statuses is maintained on our website. And countries must officially request that APHIS perform either an animal health evaluation for official disease status or freedom, or for a commodity-based evaluation if, for example, a country vaccinates for foot and mouth disease. So if we focus on swine diseases only, free status for APHIS can be granted for classical swine fever, foot and mouth disease, and swine vesicular disease. However, when an outbreak occurs of African swine fever in a country or region, we place them on our disease affected list. So these are different lists, free versus effective, and these can also be different than the list that WOA maintains. And if a disease or a pest is detected in a country or region with an official status, then APHIS will remove that country from our free lists, or we will put them on the affected list. And my unit, Regionalization Evaluation Services, is constantly monitoring disease detections in other countries, and we issue import alerts regarding those restrictions in response to those detections. And for pork and pork products, countries have to have official disease status not only for African swine fever, but also for the other swine diseases, classical swine fever, foot and mouth disease, and swine vesicular disease. And often the APHIS disease evaluation bundles these diseases together when we can. Now, we realize that WOA does no longer recognize swine vesicular disease as a reportable disease, but for APHIS regulations, we must still include that into our evaluations. Another tool and an excellent strategy for safeguarding the U.S. that we use against disease incursions and minimizing trade disruptions is the establishment of zoning protocols. And Dr. Zepeda did a fantastic job of defining zones and zoning per WOA. And just to reiterate, a zone is a clearly defined area of a country, self-defined by the veterinary authority that contains an animal population or subpopulation with a distinct animal health status for a specific disease. And we must receive a request from another country, or a request must be made by one country for another country to enter in an agreement to accept each other's zones. And for APHIS, we call these zoning protocols. Now, for us, the goal of a zoning protocol is bilateral recognition of zones by trading partners. And the U.S. prioritizes these zoning protocols with trading partners that import large volumes of U.S. commodities. And of course, the best time to negotiate zoning protocols is during peacetime or before a disease occurs. That way, they can be quickly implemented once a disease outbreak does happen. And these protocols are usually very disease specific and for a very defined animal population or subpopulation. And they also need to be regularly reviewed to ensure that they are based on current scientific information. Again, as Dr. Zepeda had addressed these, we have some similar slides. But to switch direction, why do we create our domestic zones? Well, zoning recognition is a critical tool for maintaining trade from disease-free areas during an outbreak. And through zoning protocols with our trading partners, we can prevent, limit, or remove these trading bans such that an outbreak in one or few of a few U.S. states doesn't result in a ban for the entire U.S. And by establishing zones, movement of animals, products, and contaminated fomites can be restricted, thus creating epidemiological separation between the herds or the flocks of differing disease status and focusing our control and eradication efforts in those affected areas. When you have a country as large as the United States, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, longer countries such as Chile, when you go north to south, establishing these zones is very critical. And the timeline for establishing zoning protocols, again, preferably during peacetime, and the actual timeline for establishing them depends on the depth and the scope of the various steps in the process. And for APHIS, we require a document review, so there's a sharing of information between the two countries. We perform audits or site visits to confirm the information. The protocol has to define the level of detail that's going to be included in that protocol, the types and levels of internal review that must occur, whether there are multiple units within the government, whether it's multiple agencies within the government that have to do the clearances, and whether or not legislative or regulatory changes are needed. All will affect the timeline in getting these completed. And thus, negotiating and amending zoning protocols, it's very time consuming. And however, if it actually achieves the goal of minimizing those trade disruptions in the middle of an outbreak, then it's time well spent. It's preparation. So during outbreak events, then APHIS trade staffs will send reports to our trading partners of what's occurring in our country to facilitate timely removal of those trade restrictions and to reestablish trade. And the process includes responding to additional questions from our trading partners, including providing information on our zoning procedures, the identified control areas for the outbreak, disease control measures, movement controls, and any enhanced surveillance that's being performed during the outbreak. And if a zoning protocol is already in place before the outbreak occurs, the process of removing or reducing those trade bans is a much quicker, smoother process. So the third tactic, and again, Dr. Zepeda briefly discussed protection zones, but what the APHIS did is following the detection of African swine fever in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, APHIS established in September 2021 a self-declared protection zone around Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. At the same time, APHIS also self-declared historical freedom from African swine fever for all 50 states and its territories. And this involves submitting a comprehensive dossier to WOA for review and publication. And among other tactics, this allowed APHIS to enforce stricter movement controls, intensify the surveillance efforts that we had for these diseases, or for this particular disease, and for fortifying the barriers of potential entry to keep African swine fever out of both Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, but also the remainder of the United States. And following establishment of the protection zone, APHIS issued a federal order in September of 2021, suspending the interstate movement of all swine, live swine, swine germplasm, swine products, and swine byproducts from Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands to the U.S. mainland. We also subsequently revised that federal order a few months later to allow processed or heat-treated pork products and byproducts to move interstate under certain conditions. But passenger baggage, we increased the inspections of those, and any product containing pork has to be commercially labeled, shelf-stable, canned, hermetically sealed, or fully cooked. No homemade or home-cooked products are allowed. And if it cannot be determined that the product does not contain pork, via the labels, then it's not allowed entry into the mainland. Commercial shipments are inspected by the USDA Food Safety and Inspection Service, and their inspectors are assigned to each of the facilities. They ensure that the facility is meeting the standards as provided in the facility's food safety management system, or what we call the HACCP plan. These plans include cooking times and temperatures, which will render the African swine fever virus inactive. So here's a larger view of the geographical location of both Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, especially as they relate to the Dominican Republic and Haiti and other islands within the Caribbean. And as you can see, both Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands are at a higher risk for African swine fever incursion than the remainder of the United States due to their proximity to the DR and to Haiti, as well as due to the human movements of swine and pork products via the inter-island boat traffic. So to control this, APHIS has worked very closely with the Department of Homeland Security's Customs and Border Protection Agency, the United States Coast Guard, and the Puerto Rican Police Force to enhance the surveillance specifically to the protection zone, especially including potentially illegal boat landings. And illegal boat landings are any landing of a vessel at a location not designated as a customs port or port of entry under the authority of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And the response to illegal boat landings is to mitigate the potential introduction of live animals, contaminated food or food waste, and other fomites that could introduce ASF virus into Puerto Rico or the U.S. Virgin Islands. That also includes feral pigs, although the likelihood of having a feral pig on your boat when you're transporting to another island is pretty slim. But as part of the interagency response to these illegal boat landings, APHIS is responsible for disposing of all of these confiscated swine commodities and during these responses. And so the response actually includes inspection of the vessel that's landing, the landing location to ensure that there are no swine commodities or other risky materials that have been brought in, inspection of a 3-kilometer surveillance area for garbage feeding premises around that landing area, coordination with the official veterinarian for surveillance testing of any susceptible swine premises that are identified within that 3-kilometer surveillance area, and that occurs on both 10 and 20 days post-landing. So APHIS also works with all of the U.S. states and territories to enforce the Swine Health Protection Act, which provides rules for feeding human food waste to pigs. And this practice is known as garbage feeding and can spread harmful diseases to swine, including African swine fever. And the Swine Health Protection Act mandates that industrially produced garbage or swill be heat treated to inactivate pathogens that could be injurious to swine. And to kill any harmful viruses or bacteria, the food waste must be cooked at 212 degrees Fahrenheit or boiled for 30 minutes prior to feeding it to pigs. And under the Swine Health Protection Act, owners must be licensed in order to feed this type of product to their pigs. And commercial premises that feed garbage are registered in the Emergency Management Response System. So producers receive routine inspections from APHIS and or state employees to make sure that the garbage being fed to their swine undergoes the proper cooking and handling. And this occurs in both the protection zone and in the continental U.S. in those states that do allow garbage feeding, and not all states do. Additionally, in Puerto Rico, APHIS personnel perform surveillance activities at all the swine premises, and these visits include inspections, temperature checks for the proper cooking of the garbage, and diagnostic sampling when indicated. So feral swine are certainly a concern of introduction and spread of swine diseases, including African swine fever, and thus we increase our efforts to control populations of feral swine and enhance the surveillance in this population. And that has occurred. The increase has occurred since the inception of the protection zone. Previously, that was occurring to some extent, but with the establishment of the protection zone, that has significantly increased. And APHIS has increased efforts to reduce the numbers of feral swine with both baiting, trapping, and with sharpshooters. and states and territories have increased personnel to depopulate feral swine and to work with APHIS on enhanced surveillance in feral swine for both African and classical swine fevers. And all the submitted samples thus far have been confirmed negative to both African and classical swine fevers at the USDA APHIS Veterinary Services Laboratory in Puerto Rico, when they've been samples in Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands, and at the National Veterinary Services Laboratories for any samples from feral swine on the mainland. Here's an enhanced surveillance map that has been done, that we've been doing in Puerto Rico, and this map shows the scale of the surveillance operations, and this is for both domestic and feral swine. The orange circles are locations of inspected illegal boat landings, and as you can see, they've occurred all around the island of Puerto Rico, not just on the side adjacent to or close to the Dominican Republic. The green circles represent swine premises that have had regulatory inspections and surveillance and have been confirmed negative. The black X represents sites where feral swine surveillance has occurred and animals have been confirmed negative for both African and classical swine fevers. And the clusters of black spots, those are feral swine sites that have been tested, and these align with locations that were previously identified as having the highest feral swine populations on the island. And for Puerto Rico, the majority of the feral swine have been either potbelly pigs or potbelly pig crosses. And that is not a typical feral swine population that you might see in other locations, such as the southern United States, where it's predominantly wild boar. So APHIS has also ramped up surveillance for other swine hemorrhagic, for all of the swine hemorrhagic diseases, both African swine fever and classical swine fever in all the states and territories, as I previously mentioned. And this occurs in any pigs that are displaying signs that are compatible with either of those two diseases. And these will require a foreign animal disease investigation. Samples are also taken from sick pigs that are submitted to veterinary diagnostic laboratories for testing. And those are also tested then for African swine fever and classical swine fever. Samples are taken from pigs that are condemned to slaughter, pigs that are considered high risk, such as those that are raised outdoors with potential exposure to feral swine, or pigs that are fed garbage, and of course, feral swine. And the samples from the feral swine are collected by APHIS's Wildlife Services. So I've provided a link to our swine hemorrhagic fever surveillance dashboard on the previous slide, but in case you have trouble clicking on that particular link, I've also added a barcode onto this slide that you can scan with your phone, and it will take you to our dashboard. And this is an image from the dashboard. It contains the summary of our swine hemorrhagic fever surveillance to date. And it includes the data for all the United States, not just for the protection zone. And as you can see from these yellow arrows, there was definitely an upward trend in the surveillance sampling that had occurred after we established that protection zone. Finally, I'm going to move on to briefly mention compartmentalization, since it is included with zoning in the WOA chapter. APHIS provided a full presentation on this topic during the 91st WOA general session this past May, and Dr. Zepeda did an excellent job earlier talking about compartmentalization. So I'll just briefly repeat what he said, that WOA defines compartmentalization as an animal subpopulation defined primarily by management and husbandry practices related to biosecurity. And following this, APHIS established our regulatory authority for the U.S. industry to establish and develop compartments. And so APHIS defines compartments as any defined animal subpopulation contained in one or more establishments under a common biosecurity management system for which surveillance, control, and biosecurity measures have been applied with respect to a specific disease. And the following slides, I'm going to compare and contrast regions and compartments. Dr. Zepeda, again, did an excellent job doing this, so I won't go into a huge amount of detail. But as I previously mentioned, the terms regions and regionalization are often interchangeably used, and with zones and zoning. And as I mentioned, APHIS does not use them synonymously. But just to give you just a general hierarchy of compartmentalization, they are non-binding international guidelines, which are presented in Chapter 4.4, the WOA Terrestrial Animal Health Code, and this identifies the rules and regulations. This is what we use to then create the rules and regulations regarding compartmentalization in the United States. And the United States law provides the oversight authority and establishes the operational details used by our industry to meet those rules and regulations and the criteria for USDA to approve and certify those compartments. And finally, the specific criteria that we use, which is a questionnaire to evaluate the compartments established by another competent authority, including our own that we have established. So some of the key differences between regions and compartmentalizations, again, Dr. Cepeda did an excellent job, so I'm just going to briefly mention these, that, regions are geographical, political, or surveyed boundaries. And an example very similar to his, you establish an affected zone or not free, establish that barrier or zone line, and then outside of that zone is the free zone. And whereas the compartment is a epidemiological boundary, and those can be contained in 2 or more sites or facilities, and they have a common management system, and they perform surveillance, control, and biosecurity that are applied throughout that compartment for 1 or more diseases. And these can also be in an affected region, and even next door to an affected premises, as long as that compartment is a contained entity and there's no outside entry or exit. And again, another image is that this just shows that the compartment, as evidenced by the arrows showing the movements between those free portions of the compartment, are separate from those affected non-compartmental areas. So there's always significant challenges and some uncertainty surrounding trade and preventing foreign animal disease incursions. For the United States, APHIS staff work to mitigate those challenges and to plan for the unexpected, focusing on diseases that present a significant risk to food and agriculture. And no matter if you use one or all of the tools that we've talked about today, it's critical for all countries that their local governments, industry, and federal entities communicate and work closely together to ensure prevention of introduction, protection of agriculture and the economy, that response to any detections occurs quickly, and that recovery from those detections is swift and thorough. And while trade is not typically at the forefront of everyone's minds, when there's a suspicious case, it's always important. It's always an important aspect to consider from the very beginning of an outbreak and during pre-outbreak recovery planning, as those actions taken during the response phase post-confirmation of a foreign animal disease may affect the acceptance of those decisions by your trading partners and can ultimately affect recovery of trade. And the final thought I want to leave with you is that ultimately trust and transparency between trading partners is absolutely critical for maintaining trade, and there are a number of tools available to prepare for African swine fever and other disease incursions and maintenance of trade. And our goal is to ensure that trade flows as smoothly, predictably, and fairly as possible. If you'd like more information about APHIS processes or the information I provided you today, this is our contact information for my unit, for the Regionalization Evaluation Services unit. And we are also, as I previously mentioned, responsible for developing the zoning protocols. Thank you for your attention, and I appreciate any questions.
Muchas gracias, doctora Craig.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tracy. I believe that this exemplifies the application of zoning, compartmentalization, and how it has been applied by the U.S. We are going to leave the questions for your presentation and those for the next presentation for the end. So I would like to invite you to send all your questions. We received some of them through the chat, be it the conventional chat or the Q&A chat. So Again, thank you very much, Dr. Tracy, and we'll see you soon. Now, I would like to invite our next speaker, Dr. Figueroa. So, I will tell you a little bit about him. Dr. Gabriel Figueroa has worked as a researcher at the National Institute of Agricultural and Livestock Research of 2010. He started working for the National Food Safety Centers in ASICA, the administrative body of the Agricultural Secretariat and Livestock Development in Mexico, on different positions, among which we can mention the department head for administration of free zones and deputy director of regionalization. Currently, Dr. Figueroa is the epidemiological director for animal health, and among his responsibilities, there is the establishment of policies aimed at maintaining surveillance for pests and diseases on terrestrial animals, aquatic organisms, and its products, both at national and international level, to recommend the measures aimed at the improvement and maintenance of the health situation at national level in favor of public health, food safety, and safe trade. After introduction, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Figueroa for his presentation and for him to share his screen. Good morning. First of all, on behalf of our Director General, Dr. Calderon, and Dr. Gutierrez, thank you for the invitation. I would like to share information with you. This is not new. The truth is that this is a topic that we have been working with for the past couple of years. And obviously, because of the interest that it generates for the definition of a regionalization policy, let me share my screen. Good morning, and thank you for being with us. Do you have a microphone or a headset, or can you get closer to the computer, please?
¿Ahí se escucha bien?
Can you hear fine? I'll try and speak louder. Can you see my presentation? As I was saying, my presentation this is not the first time that we share information. We've had forums with the US and Canada, and we have shared information regarding African swine fever. And not to go deeper into what Dr. Cepeda has already mentioned, we do recognize that regionalization is a tool that has been recommended by the World Trade Organization and WOA on many trade agreements between the US, Canada, and Mexico, for example. It is recognized that indeed we will be applying these regionalization strategies and compartmentalization in order to maintain trade. But the key is that this is about maintaining trade, and this is about money. It's not just about maintaining a health situation for animals in the interest of the country, but also to be able to maintain trade. If we don't have this into account, the use of these strategies for regionalization and compartmentalization should provide an economic benefit. Or what would it be? What will they be good for? If we do not have in a territory the need to export, there is no need to have this trade exchange, because then everything will come to a stop and there won't be any progress. So if we first identify the need to export or to have trade, that's already progress made. And it's also important to recognize which are going to be the goods that these measures will be applied to, because we do recognize that we have important tools, including risk assessment. And based on this risk assessment, we will identify which are the goods that will be considered as safe goods, and which are those that will have measures applied to them. And quickly, I want to mention that there is a list of goods that are considered as safe when it comes to ASF or other diseases, and they have some mitigation measures. And for these goods, there should not be any barriers for the trade. In the case of African swine fever, we do recognize that meat products and certainly live animals are goods that represent some risk, because the risk can be within them. So unfortunately, these are the ones that we know of globally, and the ones that are more traded and distributed. And that's the reason why we need to establish some strategies. In this case, regionalization in order to continuity of trade. This is the classic scheme for outbreaks, as Dr. Cristobal already mentioned, and also Dr. Tracy, in relation to how we can apply this outbreak control strategy. What we do is, once we identify the presence of African swine fever within our territory, what we're going to do is to close our borders, and we advise our partners that we have these, and we establish the buffer and the protection areas, and the establishment of all these areas, even though it is done immediately based on the emergency plans. It's important to recognize that it must be perfected based on the information that we will be gathering as the event goes on. With this information, we'll be able to define if the perimeters that have been previously established are appropriate, or if they need to extend them, or if we can reduce them. And this is for quarantine purposes. And also in the case of Mexico, we need to have a quarantine until this event is over. And then the purpose of having an epidemiological team is to gather all this information for sanitary or health-related events, for the application of emergency measures, in order for this data to be shared with our trade partners. And somehow they can have some certainty of keep on having trade based on the areas that are not infected, or to have everything blocked, which is going to take longer, of course. In these meetings that we had with Canada and the US, we have discussed the examples. In the case of the United States and Europe, African swine fever exists in Europe. However, there's a trade on some European areas and many European countries that are recognized as free countries, even though they are within the continental territory. Dr. Cristobal already mentioned that if this disease goes into the US, we need to have a territory that is limited. Or maybe we can close part or the whole territory, and the same applies to Canada or Mexico. And if we take a look at this situation, why? Because, for example, in Europe, there are borders that are going to help control transit between countries. And this is not the case in our territory unless we mark some boundaries. If Canada had this mobilization control in order to establish a border between the eastern and western territories, then in the event of the entry of ASF in one of these territories, they could control the transit of animals, products, and byproducts to the other territories. And this way, we can be safe. And the same applies to the U.S. and the territories that are not continental, like Hawaii, Alaska, and Puerto Rico. And eventually, they could do this within the continental territory. Thinking about this situation in Mexico, and also considering, as I mentioned before, all the benefits of international regulations, we are currently working on the determination of the northwestern and northeastern zones, which are the ones that are in green. We have Sonora, which is one of the states that have been authorized for exports. And to the other side, we have the state of Yucatan, which is another authorized territory for exporting purposes. And the idea of doing so is that in the center area of our territory or any other state, we have an outbreak or focus of African swine fever. Immediately, we can absolutely close these two territories that we consider to be free by implementing a barrier or some sort of border in order to prevent any risky goods to enter into these territories. And I mean a border because just like we have inspection control in order to go from the US to Mexico and the other way around, or from other countries, then we will be implementing these same barriers with inspections at ports, airports, and roads. And this inspection will be aimed, obviously, at all those travelers that go from areas that have not recognized within these green zones, in order to prevent these risky goods to enter into the territory. And in addition, we need to implement all other measures and also mobilization of control and anything that we can do, which will also be implemented. And to attain this is the progress made so far in Mexico. First, in Mexico, we are currently working on the update of our regulatory framework for African swine fever. Basically, we have two specific documents. One is an agreement for actions and measures to prevent the entry of this disease into the country. And then we have the DENISA agreement, which is our national device for animal health. Both documents have already considered the implementation of border control to protect these areas that are important because of the exports. And as part of all these regulations, we are mentioning something that is going to be really important for all of us. Unfortunately, currently, we are not recognizing compartments that are ASF free. What we do recognize are free territories. So what this document does is to clarify that situation. And we also state that if any other country is interested in implementing the same type of controls, we can commit to review the information provided by the country, establishing the actions and measures that they will apply, and eventually we can previously recognize, during times of peace, we can recognize this regionalization, but only provided that the country that we are dealing with recognizes the application of these measures in the case of Mexico, or recognizes that with this territorial division, we can maintain Sonora and Sinaloa, and also the Yucatan, Campeche, and Quintana Roo as free zones that can continue exporting. And this is important because we are talking about something reciprocal. And we already have an operating manual for these border locks, which we call sanitary locks, because they operate the same way in which the locks of a vessel work. If water comes in, we immediately have this lock in order to maintain the floatability and safety. And this is something that's already been applied in airports, maritime ports, and inspection points in roads and highways. We currently have visits to the inspection points on roads, and we are implementing this inspection strategy. Unfortunately, the technicians that are currently working with us have experience in doing this type of inspections. So currently, we are reviewing or inspecting buses, cargo trucks, and also vehicles. And the exercise is currently being conducted for bird products, but with the canine binomials that have been trained, we will proceed to inspect swine. We have already determined our needs when it comes to personnel and also the legal amendments at national and state level that are required. And currently what we are doing, as I said, we had these two documents, the SFA agreement and the DINESA agreement. And for the ASF agreement, we are working with our legal department in order for this agreement to be revised by then and subsequently be revised by our sector lead for this document to be published. And in addition, for 2025, we will start with the application of drills. We are currently on the planning stage, and we're going to have drills when it comes to operations in Sonora, Sinaloa, and Campeche, in order to verify that the system is going to work as planned. What are the benefits, as I mentioned in the beginning? Well, it's the economic aspect. If we choose the classical way to recognize the regions, first, in the event of an outbreak or focus, Mexico will halt exports or imports from particular territories. And what we do is to require information regarding what is currently going on, and regularly we wait in order to make sure that we have what is required for as long as it takes in order for the veterinary services to give the information and approve everything. Sometimes we will have to wait from 1 or 2 to 6 months. And to this, we need to add the time the veterinarian service is going to require, be it in Mexico or other country, to go over all the data in order to establish if controls have been effective. And after this, maybe we can establish a region, and then we can do what Dr. Cristobal said. For example, if this is the affected region, this is the non-affected region, and this can be recognized as a contention zone. And now we can reestablish trade from this region that we considered as non-affected. And eventually, if the event is resolved throughout the country, then we can resume trade as a whole. However, I think that this requires a lot of effort on time. And obviously, it's going to affect the exports and the economy. And in the case of what we are proposing, this new lock approach, in the event of an outbreak of African swine fever in an exporting country, Mexico is going to maintain imports from protected areas after verifying the border locks. And then this can be almost immediate. And then we can continue with the rest of the process. We gather the information, and we need to pay attention to what's going on in the country. We go over the information, and eventually, once the problem is solved, then we can start again. And that's why we think that this is the best choice. Why? Because in this case, trade is not going to stop, but in order to reach this, it is necessary for both countries to recognize that this scheme can be feasible and it's going to operate appropriately, which is really important.
Before
ending, I wanted to just state that we're not thinking about compartmentalizing, since we're still working with disease-free zones. But given this new system of locks, we'll be able to work with smaller territories in the country. But given the fact that we'll have a system in place to control or to provide oversight. Thank you, Dr. Figueroa. So this is a good segue to the preceding presentations, and it's interesting to note how other countries are conducting compartmentalization. We have some questions in the chat for Dr. Figueroa and Dr. Sturgill. If you could also turn on your camera. Excellent. So the first question is for Dr. Sturgill. I would say that this question could also be for Dr. Figueroa. And the question is, how do you determine the distance among protection and buffer zones? How do you establish the distance in between them? Dr. Sturgill.
So for us, the protection zone is currently the islands. So we've not had to determine any distance for a specific buffer zone. Obviously, there's a large body of water in between the islands and the mainland, and that is what we're using as our buffer. For domestic planning, we have the ASF, African Swine Fever Red Book. And in that Red Book, we define the zones that we will initially enact upon a detection, with the understanding that most likely there will be a 72-hour movement standstill at a minimum 72 hours, and it may go longer, so that we can assess the size of the zones and whether they're sufficient or whether they need to be, again, as Dr. Figueroa had indicated, increased or decreased. But we do have standardized sizes established for a minimum for zones, but not for a maximum.
Adelante, doctor Figueroa.
You can also add to that, Dr. Figueroa. I think we're always used to being told what the number of kilometers is that we have to adhere to by law. So Mexico does establish a number, a 10-kilometer figure, but we have to be wary of that, because these distances are based on land and not really distance. So let me explain. It's important to implement your health measures right at the start of the operation. You have to activate that emergency plan, but you need to assess the region, and then after that assessment, you either increase or reduce that 10-kilometer area. So this is determined on the number of production units. What is the geography of that land? Many times, there are many mountains or rivers, perhaps, in that 10-kilometer zone. So that leads to a reduction in the buffer zone. So it really depends. It depends on what you think is necessary to carry out that containment.
Perfecto. Muchísimas gracias a
Okay,
ambos.
thank you so much. Thank you both for your responses. Now we have a question for Dr. Sturgill. The first one is from Luis Antonio Gomez from Zena Zika, and he says, In Puerto Rico, is there a feral swine eradication program in place in Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands?
Yes, there absolutely is. And I believe the last information I received was that for the Virgin Islands, all of the feral swine population had been eradicated. For Puerto Rico, there are still some remaining areas. Understanding that for Puerto Rico, it was a very different situation. Many of the feral swine population, as I indicated, were potbelly pigs or potbelly pig crosses, and many of those were actually in the city or towns in the very populated areas, less in the there. Of course, there are pockets of animals out in the rural areas, but many of these were actually in cities and towns, and there was an effort by personnel, both APHIS and the Puerto Rican people, to have an effort to gather these pigs. And instead of eradicating them within the cities, they relocated them outside of the cities first before depopulating them. But it was a concentrated effort, and there were outreach efforts done with the people so that they knew what was occurring, and many of the Puerto Rican people actually got involved with reporting these animals and helping with the gathering of them so that they could be eradicated.
Gracias, doctora Tracy. Eso responde la pregunta.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer. To ask Dr. Camposano to ask the next question.
Gracias. Vamos a leer la siguiente pregunta. También es del
Okay.
doctor Luis Antonio Gómez Mendieta, doctora
So,
Tracy.
for Dr. Sturgill,
¿Nos podría proporcionar datos de lo que se ha
would you
invertido en
mind
Puerto Rico y los
providing
Virgin
data
Islands
of
para erradicar las
what has
poblaciones
been
de
invested in
cerdos
Puerto Rico and the
descerebrados,
Virgin Islands to eradicate the feral pig
incluyendo los cerdos
population,
vietnamitas?
including the pot-bellied pigs? So basically, if you could provide data about investment amounts
I don't
or what.
have the, so by data, do you mean the amount of money that's been spent, or do you mean the numbers of animals that have been eradicated? Or both?
Sí, básicamente a los
Okay,
costos.
basically is cost. So how much has that cost?
I don't have those numbers right in front of me, but I can get that information and provide it to you.
Gracias.
Gracias,
Thank
doctora.
you, Dr. Sturgill.
Tenemos otra pregunta para usted.
Okay, there's another question for you.
¿Qué le recomienda a los
So what
países
do
que
you
deseen
recommend
implementar
for
estas
countries that would
medidas
like
que han
to
implementado
execute
con
the
el
measures
COVID
that you
actualmente?
have taken with Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands? What are some recommendations if a country wants to do that?
It was a very concerted effort across many groups within the U.S., including the local personnel, APHIS, obviously, not only the veterinary services, but wildlife services, international services. So it was a very concerted effort. There was a lot of coordination that needed to occur. I believe, most of our staff who were involved have very good relationships with a lot of our trading partners in other countries. And if anyone would like to have a point of contact for that, feel free to reach out to me, and I can put you in contact with the appropriate people who might be able to provide some guidance on how we went about establishing a lot of those activities.
Muchísimas gracias, doctora Tracy.
Thank you, Doctor.
Ahora unas preguntas para el doctor Figueroa.
Dr. Figueroa. Rocío?
Gracias. Doctor Luis Antonio Gómez Mendieta también nos pregunta, ¿existe alguna
Okay,
posición
Dr.
respecto
Gomez
al
Mendieta
sacrificio
says, is
silvestre
there a
de los
position
cerdos
with
en
regard to
México
feral
para
pigs
considerarlos
in
como un
Mexico
compartimento
to
diferente al de la
consider
porcicultura,
them as
como
a different
específicamente
compartment
como lo está haciendo USDA EFIS?
than pigs that are used for trade, as USDA and APHIS does? Unfortunately, it doesn't exist. We are aware of we take note of these of the population of these pot-bellied pigs, of course, but we do share information also with the U.S. regarding them. But there aren't that many in this region where we have feral pigs in Coahuila and Chihuahua, in the state of Nuevo León. There aren't really many swine farms. So it isn't an area that's prevalent for swine, where where the feral swine has been or feral pigs have been seen. So we want to work with an organization called Surmarnat, and it's our, let's say, wildlife fund, or sorry, the wildlife authority in Mexico. So the idea is to establish sort of surveillance program. So we already have a monitoring system for other type of fauna and wildlife in farms that are aimed at are used for hunting purposes or for protection. But these are animals that at some point in time escaped from farms, and they became feral. And they're huge. And they have very interesting strategies, survival strategies. And monitoring these animals is just very difficult. It's not impossible, though. But next year, that's the goal. We're also working on hunting strategies to identify and monitor populations, not only with regard to ASF, but other pests that we're also wary of. But yes, it's important to be able to note that these populations are not close to swine used for production purposes. They're, as I said, in far away from swine farms. Okay, thank you. Okay, there are two other questions. How much time has it taken Mexico and North America in general to attain these tri-national agreements and establish these epidemiological surveillance efforts, just so countries can know what they face, what challenges there are in attaining that type of agreement? Please, Tracy, go first.
Well, yes. So for many countries, the U.S. has actually been involved with developing protocols and arrangements for many years. Some countries, we have been in process with trying to develop protocols since 2015, even as early as 2012, and are still working on them. They can take a very long time. I tell people that for my unit, we play the long game. So we are always preparing for things that may occur, 15, 20 years down the road, but it can take a lot of time. Sometimes you can do things quickly, but in my limited experience in trade, those are few and far between. And there's, as I kind of mentioned in my presentation, there's a lot of sharing of information. You have to review that information, then you ask more questions, you get more information that oftentimes leads to more questions. Then you have to have meetings and conversations to clarify the information, and the information sharing oftentimes takes 2 to 3 years, if not longer. And situations change over time, so then you have to reevaluate and reassess. And I don't want to discourage anyone from doing this, but just realistically, it can take quite a long time. And it's definitely worth the time and the effort, but I would recommend that you only focus on those trading partners who either are importing a large amount of your product or who has a significant role in your economy, not to spend as much time with those trading partners that maybe don't have that large of a share of the trade, just to save time and resources. Dr. Figueroa?
Gracias.
Thank you.
Sí, efectivamente, lleva mucho tiempo, pero en función de que
Yes, I echo that. It takes much time, but especially one thing is the size of the country and the size of the trading that's taking place. Because if we're dealing with a smaller country versus the United States or Mexico, we're dealing with large amounts of territory. And the number of species there are going to be larger, or it's going to be a higher number, rather. Also, time is dependent on what types of policies are in place already, and being able to carry out risk assessments, and that is something that impacts the amount of time it would take to implement this. But I think what's great, what we really need is a great will, that both countries have the will to acknowledge this process and recognize that it's a need. So, for example, I've seen this in the past few meetings, the efforts that the U.S. has made with Canada. And I really would love to attend one of those meetings, Tracy, because really it's eye-opening. And you achieved something in record time that many countries in the world have been trying to achieve. It's impressive. And there's very good results from these negotiations. So I think that we need goodwill in place. And I would say it would take approximately 3 to 5 years to I'm just estimating, right, at a time that a country would take to implement this. Okay, thank you. Okay, this is an implicit, this is a question, and the response is implicit in your response, the responses you have already given. So what do you recommend for other official vet territories that are just thinking about implementing these types of efforts, considering the long time it takes to change laws? And okay, this was mentioned already. Dr. Figueroa mentioned it in his presentation. He spoke about how long it takes to review these implementation proposals for animal health measures. Erica, would you mind reading the next question? I think that's it. There is one comment made by Dr. Oriamuno. He spoke about training. Dr. Sturgill, would you like to just add something about training?
Go ahead and finish with that comment, but then I do have something to add after.
Bueno, quería agregar, pero quería que usted terminara el comentario.
No, adelante.
No, go ahead. That was it. Because we're going to change topics. So if you could just comment on that, and then we'll switch topics.
It's not in relation to training, but just in relation to the protection zone that the U.S. developed. As I mentioned, we had to submit a declaration of freedom first for the country before we could submit that protection zone. And it is submitting that packet of information to WOA can require a lot of information gathering, a lot of coordination, and depending upon your country and what you have available, potentially a large number of your resources. It does take some time, and they often do come back and ask additional questions. So it's not just a one-time submission. Often you have to supply clarifying information. So if you're wanting to establish a protection zone, I would suggest starting on those well in advance of any type of outbreak. And also just we touched primarily on the zoning protocols, but even developing the domestic standards within your own country for responding to a potential outbreak such as African swine fever. That takes a long time as well. And the US has obviously been working on those types of responses for a very long time, well before it was detected in the Caribbean. And just exponentially increased our activities after it was detected in the Caribbean and in the Western Hemisphere again. And so I would recommend that obviously, and not just for African swine fever, but for other potentially emerging or re-emerging diseases or spreading diseases, that you'd be considering these things well in advance of a potential incursion.
Muchísimas gracias, doctora
Okay,
Tracy.
thank you, Dr. Sturgill. Your comment definitely is timely and makes a lot of sense. With regard to Dr. Demuno's question, greetings, Dr. Demuno. There is plenty of interest in this topic and a great need to address it further, especially with many of the problems that we're experiencing, the different disease types, the PPA in Hispaniola, and other pests that we're encountering, the avian flu, etc. So training cannot be belittled, at least within the ICA framework. So this interagency initiative is part of training, and we are going to conduct more workshops on this topic with the different countries. But thanks so much for your excellent comments and your suggestions. So I think this leads to the conclusion of the webinar. I would like to thank the presenters. I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Martinez, who's going to summarize the different responses from the panel. But before thanking Dr. Sturgill and Dr. Figueroa, thank you so much for your excellent thank you so much for your presentations.
Y de hecho, el comentario del doctor Oramuno nos ahonda más de cómo llegarles a la región. Ese es el
This is being very useful as for the mechanisms that we are currently using, and the advantage of working together under a single platform is that you can reuse again all the information in the regions, be it OIRSA, be it CDP, Calacan, Caribe, CAPSA, or any other, because we are all regions involved, and the northern countries are also deeply involved. We have technical and administrative personnel taking part in all the activities and also in the preparation of the agenda in order to develop the best way possible to be able to tend to all these webinars covering all the needs that the countries submit to us. I think that this webinar on zoning has been really interesting for the countries all the way from the beginning. I would like to thank Dr. Cepeda for joining us as part of this work, because we have as basis international regulations for the strategic basis or the definition from WOA in relation to all the countries and the implementation of the use and application of definitions, both for zoning, compartmentalization, and now we have contention and protection zones too. So the work that we have been doing on each of these expectations for the countries, and then Tracy and Gabriel provided us with examples that both Mexico and the US have implemented on the different areas and how they've done it step by step. We know, and I am currently quoting Tracy from her presentation, and I think that they have said the same, although in different works. We work on this during times of peace. So the idea is for all countries to start step by step to structure how they will implement their work plans, their protocols, and regarding how they will face the situation when the need arises. Hopefully it won't, but that's, of course, our desire and that of our institutions. But we are here to support you in the development of the plans and the steps to follow for those of you that do not have strategies defined yet. We'll work together. And I think that all the questions that we've received from participants speak to the need that they have to know about how to structure and how all these countries have been working with the examples. Dr. Cepeda, on his presentation, showed some of the examples regarding how to do all of this and how the country can implement their actions based on the needs that have been established. And we can also share the links to other people that were not here before to see if, as part of the veterinarian services, and they know that people wanted to be here because we know that this is so important. So you can go and listen to the recording and share it. And I think that if we have additional questions, I think that all doctors will be willing to answer to each one of your additional questions that might arise later on. We are, as all the institutions, are really glad to have you with us. I think we had approximately 160 participants, more than that. So in average, taking into without including ourselves, but for us, it's really interesting because this is something that we see in our Zoom platform, but we know that we have more people, of course, in YouTube and other social media. But the idea is for everyone to have access to this training so that we can have more strengths as part of our veterinarian services. That if you need follow-up or support from any of the organizations, we can gladly do that. I would like to thank the panel members that shared with us, Gabriel and Tracy. Thank you very much for sharing your experiences with us, and Dr. Cepeda, because he's also our expert and who also shared his knowledge and is also willing to remain in contact with the countries for any additional questions. So, Erica, back to you. Thank you very much, Katia. Some announcements before closing today's webinar. Our next webinar and the last of the year will be held on the second week of December. And we will be sending all the information. We will talk about wild animals and African swine fever specifically. And we will also send a survey that we are really interested in. Please fill it out regarding the impact that these webinars have had in your countries, all those efforts. Like I said in the beginning, it's been almost 3 years from all the agencies working together, and it's really important for us. That's the feedback that we need regarding the changes made in your institutions based on all of these. And as Dr. Martinez has said, you have here, and I think that Miguel can show you a link to this platform where you can find all the webinars for all these years for you to share, as Dr. Martinez said, with anyone that was not able to connect today or to a prior webinar. I think that this is very valuable for preparation purposes to face American swine fever and other cross-border diseases. So maybe all this preparation might be similar during times of peace. And I just wanted to let you know that this is going to be our last webinar in December. We will send you all the information required for you to join. And I would also like to thank you all for being with us today We had a very important audience, and hopefully you can convey in the initiative of all these webinars with other institutions and all the people. So thank you again for the congratulations. Thank you, Dr. Tracy. Thank you, Dr. Figueroa. And obviously, Dr. Cepeda is not with us today, but his participation has been highly valuable. So again, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Camposano, Dr. Martinez, and everyone who was here today and worked on coordination for all these trainings on a monthly basis. So again, thank you very much, and see you in our next webinar. Bye-bye.
Chao, gracias a todos.
Thank you, everyone.
Gracias, Gabriel.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Gabriel.